Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Green Ribbon Commission Climate Action Exchange. My name is Amy Longsworth, and along with my colleague John Cleveland, we staff the Boston Green Ribbon Commission. The GRCx is a virtual interactive program series designed to support the Green Ribbon Commission mission of accelerating the implementation of Boston's Climate Action Plan. Before we dive in, a few logistical notes. We are recording this session. Shortly after it, you'll get an email with a link to the recording and the slides, so you will get all the slides. And the way we're going to run today's session is I'm going to do a little introduction, and then each panelist, each of our four, will speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll have a good, healthy 45 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. If you have questions for the panelists, please put them into the chat box. That's where we're drawing the Q&A from. So let's dive right in. Our topic today is how private sector organizations are gearing up to meet or even beat the City of Boston's climate goals, which are to be carbon neutral by 2050, to be resilient to the impacts of climate change, and to make progress on those fronts in a way that advances environmental justice and equity. So that's from the city side. From the institutional side, climate action planning is an essential element of institutional risk management, as well as an opportunity to invigorate organizational priorities and practices and to refine management systems. The Boston Green Ribbon's Collaborative Climate Action Planning Program is designed to reduce common barriers to identifying and managing climate risks and to support organizations in creating practical roadmaps for climate action. We first launched this group last year in June with a group of 10 adventurous Boston cultural institutions, and they'll finish up their group process in June of this year. We wanted to create a peer learning community that could expand and deepen education around carbon mitigation, resiliency to climate impacts like heat and flooding, and climate justice. So this program today is sort of a 2/3 of the way through report on the experiences, the progress, and the expected future actions for these institutions. It's also, I should mention that today's GRCx is in part a follow-on to a program we co-presented last fall with CoStep Massachusetts called Climate Resiliency for Cultural Heritage. So I just want to say thank you to CoStep and all the CoStep members who are joining us here today. I'm very happy to welcome 3 members of our cultural institutions working group that have been part of this collaborative climate action planning cohort, and as well as Dallas Scott, our expert facilitator, who's been leading this whole process. I really also just want to thank, aside from their presence here today with us to share, I want to thank Christine and Cliff and Paul for the amazing contribution they've all made to the group. And this has been especially during a year when their organizations have been extremely challenged by 2 disruptive years of pandemic. So let me introduce the panelists briefly, and then we'll get going. Christine Francois is the Programs and Sustainability Coordinator at the Esplanade Association. Christine has broad experience in travel, sustainability, and education, and she aims to make the Charles River Esplanade an innovative, climate-ready destination for tourists and residents. She holds a bachelor's degree in marine science from Boston University, a master's in science in environmental science and policy from Johns Hopkins University. Next is Clifford Rust, who, as he wrote, and I love this, has the honor and privilege of being the Chief Financial and Administrative Officer at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. His previous positions include VP of Finance and Administration of the Handel and Haydn Society, General Manager of the Boston Music Company, and General Manager of the Boston Music Company. He holds an MBA from Babson College and a BA from Dartmouth College. And last but hardly least is Paul Ippolito, Vice President of Facilities and Building Operations at the Museum of Science in Boston, where he has been for 13 years with responsibility for strategic direction of the museum's physical facilities and public safety, building renewal projects, building management systems, facilities maintenance, engineering, custodial services, grounds management, and energy efficiency programs. Prior to joining the Museum of Science, he was at MSK Instruments, a global provider of process control solutions. And so in addition to our three panelists, we have Dallas Scott, who is the founder and principal of Trust. And Dallas has been leading and facilitating the process with these 10 cultural organizations who are doing climate action planning. She brings a wealth of experience in strategy, organizational design, change management, and design thinking that is unique in the field of sustainability consultants. And I will underscore that is unique. Her balance of empathy, transparency, and structured engagement support and guide stakeholders through an engagement and decision-making process that meets the needs and long-term vision of the institution. Over the past 10 years, she has been working with more than 40 higher education institutions across all their stakeholders, as well as a number of mission-driven organizations and collectives such as Second Nature and the Ivy Plus Sustainability Consortium. So we will start with Dallas and then proceed on to our other three panelists, and then we'll have Q&A. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Amy. And I'm very excited to be here today. I'm going to set up my screen for all of you so I can present today. So Amy touched on this out of the gate of the purpose of the Green Ribbon Commission, and that ties clearly to the purpose of this collaborative climate action planning program, which is strategies for fighting climate change in coordination with the city's climate action plan. So, you know, I have a little snapshot of that was pulled from the city's climate action plan, some of the goals that the city of Boston has put forward, and underscoring that not only do they want to reflect on adaptation and mitigation, but also doing so and designing in an equitable way and focusing on the climate justice piece of it. And we can look at this and we can feel very proud that Boston is moving our city in this direction. But I think our next question is recognizing that the city of Boston does not own all of the buildings. And there's a lot of other stakeholders involved. And so then the question is, this sounds great, but how are we going to do that? So working with the Green Ribbon Commission, it really is how do we support all the sectors within the city of Boston to develop their own climate action planning process that can help meet and ideally beat the city's climate action plan and their goals. So this is where the process of developing a climate action planning process with a cohort came into place, and recognizing, you know, what if we were to do this instead of trying to take it on individually, really recognize there's an opportunity to do it within a sort of a community setting, a cohort setting. So I'm going to talk through that with the process and what this looks like. So we recognize there would need to be an investment in order for this to be successful. So the Green Ribbon Commission, you know, their investment was hiring myself as sort of the project manager and also to be the lead facilitator for this process. Also, of working with consultants and technical experts, we were able to partner with Cadmus and Greener U through this process to support some of the mitigation and adaptation, and also some of the resiliency technical information for the group, creating a guidebook, facilitating cohorts, and creating space for learning sessions, and overall supporting the group with the publicity of their climate action plans. But we were asking of the participants as well, mostly their time to show up to the meetings that we were putting together, these cohort sessions, to bring these ideas back to their organizations, and to recognize that this is going to not only involve the time of the people who were part of the cohort, sort of the active members, but other staff time, and making sure that the climate action plan is something that is adapted and bought into by the broader community. And then there's also the recognition that at the end of the day, there is going to be an opportunity to do deeper dive analysis of their buildings and sort of the financial investment that might be farther down the road for the organization. The next thing is really looking at these step-by-step cohort meetings. So the purpose of the cohort meetings is for people to show up, the key stakeholders of the different organizations to show up to learn and understand more fully the carbon mitigation, climate resiliency, and climate justice. So we had representation. Some organizations had 1 or 2 members. Some just had 1 member that showed up to each of these cohort meetings where they got to, learn about baselining and developing the stakeholder map and how they're going to bring everyone together through this process. And then what they got to do next is to bring it back to their organization and be the liaison and not only inform and educate, but develop buy-in for the climate action planning process that they were creating as part of this cohort. We went through, it's a 12-month process. And so this little Gantt chart here sort of shows how we broke down the step-by-step of this collaborative climate action planning. So there's these high-level steps that we knew we needed to take to guide the organizations through a climate action plan. There's the groundwork, so securing leadership and organizational planning process. There's the baselining and training. Then there's developing the plan. So what are your goals and strategies, and what does the development structure for implementation look like? And then we also recognize that celebration and communication should be part of these processes too, which you'll see here. The other thing I would like to point out is we also had scheduled office hours to allow for institutions to jump in if they had just some clarifying questions, because each one of our organizations were so unique that we knew that these cohort sessions, which were most of the time 2 hours, there might be more there than we would be able to fit for all the different starting points for the organizations and the size of the organizations that we have, which I'll get to now. The group also had an opportunity with our resources is we had a guidebook that we put online. So it's a Google website where they could access all their materials. We used, we called our whiteboard. So we had notes that were interactive that people could look at and take part of. And every organization had sort of their backpack or a Google Drive where they could keep their folders and templates and things that they were able to utilize throughout the process. And here's a little bit of a snapshot of what the website looked like. So we had clickable links for everyone to be able to dive deeper in specific topics where the agendas were. They were able to kind of at a glance look at all the organizations that took part in this year, as well as other important links that they might need to have access to. And at the end of the day, what we're looking for is creating a space where you get to learn and workshop together, where you take it back to engage with your organization. And a lot of the steps in between each of our meetings, there's homework assignments to use other stakeholders to give feedback to your processes. And then they got to bring it back and reflect with the group and iterate the next version of their plan or their baselining, not only with the feedback from their peers, but also from our technical experts and other people who have taken part in the cohort as coaches for each of the organizations here. And the hope is, and the thing that I've been able to see, is that we've been able to amplify the impact, mostly because there's so much cross-pollination and learning from each other that, one person's presentation allowed another organization to sort of leapfrog over some of the concerns or barriers that they had because of that problem solving together, that workshopping and reflection as a group. The entire program and process was built upon behavioral theory and organizational change, which is with my background, and really thinking about, just pointing here, some of these behavioral elements of what it is what can get in the way of change. I'm trying to change not only yourself behaviors, but organizational behaviors. So we really thought through what might be the limitations of time, What might be the limitations of just knowledge and there's just like too much information out there? What might be the financial limitations? So all of these things we were put in mind in developing this program for everybody. And so, one of the things I'm highlighting here, some of the things we tried to tackle, what we knew might be challenges, but we wanted to make it user-friendly. We wanted to do the work of curating the information at hand, getting tools and templates that were bite-sized for the organization. And curation of best practices, because there's so much out there that we could bring the best practices to the cohort to really reduce the barrier of too much information. So how can we refine that? How can we make best use of everyone's time there? And how can we put it in one place? So like put it in the website for them to find easily. We wanted to really think about capacity building. It would be great for everyone to walk away with the climate action plan, but our actual goal is for them to implement their climate action plan, which means, developing the skill set of, facilitating this work within their organization, better understanding and deepening the knowledge of the climate emergency and the tools and resources that their institution might have to support this effort, to walk away with those skills in hand and not just relying on sort of our technical consultants for that. And then lastly, we wanted to be engagement focused, because engagement starts with the development of the climate action planning, but we want people to feel curious and to build the trust and to create the buy-in needed for it to be successful, for it to be implementable. So all of that was part of our theory of change and the reason why we developed the collaborative climate action planning framework with all of this in mind, to optimize the success of everyone who is to participate, and fully knowing that for all of our participants who join, this isn't their full-time job. This is like, they have so much going on. And so we really wanted it to make it attainable for each of the organizations. So what I'm going to do now is I have a Zoom poll that I would like that we'll launch in just a moment, where we want to know where you are, all of our participants today who are joining. Where does your organization stand with climate action planning? So I'll give you a moment to look at that. And then the last thing that I want to share is we are working on our 2022-2023 cohort planning process. So we are going to be having 2 cohorts this year. One is going to be a cultural group cohort, similar to what we have here, but different set of organizations. And we're also going to have a higher education cohort. So I'm going to put in the chat a Google form. So if you have interest in doing this in the future, please sign up. Even if you're not a cultural group or higher educational institution, please sign up. We will keep you in the loop of how all of our collaborative climate action planning processes progress. So with that, I will stop sharing and pass it on.
Great, thank you, Dallas. Sorry, I had to unmute there for a second. A lot of questions, just quickly, let's just get one out of the way. The guidebook is not available yet outside of the cohort, but making it available and getting a good, robust online platform is part of our scale-up plan. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, we specifically made the website private so everyone could share information internally within the cohort, but we are working on a public one eventually.
Yeah. Okay, great. So thanks for all the questions already pouring in on the chat. And I'd like to turn it over to Christine Francois from the Esplanade Association.
Thanks, Amy. So yes, I am Christine Francois. I'm the Programs and Sustainability Coordinator at Esplanade Association. And go to the next slide. So just a little background information about Esplanade Association. We are a nonprofit that's been in place for the past 20 years that works to revitalize and enhance the park. Some ways we do it is through capital projects, restoring the lawns and the memorials, We also offer multiple programs for free to the greater Boston community. So with our climate action plan, some of the first steps we did is just assessing the different climate risks that the Esplanade faces. So one of the biggest risks is coastal flooding. The image in the upper right shows the risks of coastal flooding in the 2070s. So it's only 50 years away, but as you can see, the entire Esplanade is at risk of being in flooding, as well as different parts of the city of Boston. So this shows that the park itself will act as a natural barrier to the city to avoid flooding. So we know for our plan, flood management is a really important piece. Some things we're thinking about is increasing the amount of impermeable surfaces, as well as assessing the soil nutrition. And then the second piece or climate risk we looked at is the urban heat island effect. So the Esplanade itself is not at risk of this. It won't get as hot because of all the trees, but different parts of the city are really at risk. In the bottom right image, you can see the red and orange, and these are areas with multiple buildings and pavements. So people, especially in the summer months, are going to think, where can I go someplace that's cooler? And that's where the Esplanade comes in. So we know that in those months and as it gets hotter, we'll have to think of ways that the park can be more accessible to everyone so that they can have a place to cool down. Next slide. So then with these risks in mind, we created an internal working group that consists of at least 5 different members from the organization to develop the climate action plan and help develop the climate action statement. In addition to the GRC meetings, we met bi-weekly to check in on our progress. And in those meetings, we're able to create the statement and then also keep working on the plan. And one important thing that we did for our climate action statement is that we integrated our overarching goals that we have for the plan in the statement itself. So as we keep creating the plan and keep developing it, we always know where our main focus is. So we always know what to go back to as we write our strategies and our actions. So here is our climate action statement that's been approved by our board. And here on the bottom, you can see our 3, it says actions in the statement, but these are our goals. So the first is enhancing our stewardship of the Esplanade's ecosystem to foster resiliency, biodiversity, and human health. The second, to ensure our outreach, educational, cultural, and recreational programs to incorporate environmental justice principles. And then the third, achieve carbon neutrality in the park and as an organization by 2030. So here is the Jamboard, which is a great tool that GRC showed us. In orange, it has our main goals. And I guess to rewind, we use this to kind of lay out what our goals will be, what our sub goals will be, our strategies, and then actions. So in orange, we have our main goals. And then in blue, we have our sub goals because our goals are broad and we wanted them to be broad so we can have sub goals in between, and then we can make our strategies more specific and then our actions even more specific than that. And here's just a breakdown of that. So our goal was enhancing the stewardship of Esplanade's ecosystem to foster resiliency, biodiversity, and human health. And then the sub goal is to particularly look at the biodiversity. The strategy is to develop and maintain the lasting Arbor Esplanade Arbor Fund tree care plan, which is our plan to help build and maintain the tree canopy. And then we have several different actions. There are more actions, they just can't all fit on the slide. But some of them include remove dead, dying, and diseased trees, to commit to new soil decompaction and testing, and then to commit to a pruning schedule for our whole tree canopy. And this is like the stage we are in the plan right now, where we're really thinking about all the different actions, which ones we should prioritize first, based on the resources, the partners we will work with, and the impact that they'll have. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Christine. Let me now turn it over to Cliff from the Gardner.
Thanks, Amy. Hello, everybody. In thinking through how best to structure my thoughts today, I thought it would make sense to talk about where we were with this work prior to joining the cohort, and then what our experience has been working with the cohort, and then where we expect to be after working with the cohort. And before launching into that, though, I did want to apologize for the lighting of my image on the screen. I'm not in witness protection. I just don't have a backlight for it, so apologize for that. So before joining the cohort, we had or were involved in a variety of initiatives that weren't connected to an overall plan with specific goals or targets. And the next slide, please. Some of these were low-hanging fruit, like working on a comprehensive lighting retrofit program and working with Greener U. Others took some significant planning, like installing 16 geothermal wells and building a LEED certified building 10 years ago. All of these, however, grew out of overall strong leadership support for energy resilience and responsible behavior. And in fact, our current board president, Will York, is a member of the GRC. So we were fortunate in not needing to develop board support from the ground up for all of the work in developing and continuing to work on our climate action plan. Interestingly, the attitude or perspective for that support goes all the way back to the founding of the museum back in 1924. The mission of the organization, going back to the will of Isabella Stewart Gardner, includes the preservation of the collection for the education and enjoyment of the public forever. And the inclusion of the word forever is a really important context when you think about flood mitigation and management and all the other issues that we could face. So I think even early on, before all of these conversations, the board really was an early leader in thinking through art conservation, and that factor has always focused the board on thinking more long-term than they otherwise might have. So because of that, the museum is more than predisposed to both climate resilience and climate mitigation. And with one of the core values of the current strategic plan being diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, climate justice is well aligned with the current direction of the museum as well. I did want to take a couple moments to just note some of the unique challenges as art museums grapple with climate and energy related issues. Unfortunately, art museums tend to be energy hogs because of generally accepted conservation standards for temperature and humidity ranges in galleries 24/7. I remember taking an interview with a Globe journalist early on in our first public closure during the pandemic, in which he really wanted to learn about our cost savings related to being closed to the public. His hypothesis was that clearly we would save in energy and security staffing. That actually ended up being a pretty short interview because our galleries don't care whether or not we're open to the public. While certainly there were some savings related to lighting in the galleries when we were closed, but our gallery temperature and humidity needs and our overall security needs didn't change. So I think as more art museums start to embrace climate action plan type work and thinking, it's possible that some of these restrictions may be relaxed slightly, and that could theoretically make a significant difference in energy needs. Some of these conversations are already happening around the country and the world, so we'll see how far we go with those. Moving on to the next slide, please. Regarding our work with the cohort over the past 8 months, initially, of course, I was hoping to learn about resilience and mitigation efforts from the other cohort members. And while that absolutely turned out to be true, learning about approaches to climate justice was a huge, more unexpected benefit. At the Gardner, we hadn't started even articulating an approach to climate justice prior to joining the cohort. So it was invaluable to hear from cohort colleagues. And while because of our mission and the focus of the museum in particular, we're not likely to have a dedicated exhibition on components of our climate action plan, it really didn't take much for us to start thinking of ways to potentially connect our education and our community programs with different areas of the museum, like our robust horticulture operation, which is now fully organic. I thought it might be helpful to mention my particular perspective and reasons for wanting to be personally hands-on with this work. Given the types of bandwidth challenges all of us have faced throughout the pandemic, I wanted to be involved from the get-go to facilitate the work, to signal its importance to internal and external constituents in the museum, and to ensure that there was a direct line between climate action plan work and leadership. Because of my specific role, I bring a few different institutional perspectives to the work. As CFO, obviously, I'm very interested in overall risk management, but I'm also obsessed with ensuring that we have resources in both our operating budget and in our capital plan to address annual and long-term investments for this work. From From the administrative perspective as CAO, which at the Gardner is really more of a COO perspective, I'm very interested in both the operational impact of this work and the broader organizational elements. And the next slide, please. As we start thinking about where we'll be after the work with the cohort, we're optimistic that we'll have a strong framework for approaching this work going forward that will include some valuable tools for continuing to ideate, to develop the plan, and to continue to track key metrics. Thinking of it as a framework is essential to us because I think for most organizations, and especially for us, the climate action plan will be a dynamic document, adjusting as climate change shifts and evolves and as technology shifts to address many of the challenges. And in a practical sense, it can take organizations like ours quite a while to work through some of the wordsmithing and get overall agreement for whatever we end up pushing out as external facing. I would say that working with the cohort has dramatically underlined and framed our institutional understanding of the importance of climate action plan work. With everything going on over the past 2 years, and especially over the last year, there's no way we would have made much progress at all on this work, if any, without the cohort. And because of that work, we're now thinking that external communication and sharing of the plan is a realistic item for fiscal year 23, our next fiscal year. And without the cohort, I easily could see it having taken us to FY25 to get to that same point. So that's those are my comments for today. And I think at this point, I'm passing on to Paul.
Great, thanks, Cliff. Hello, everybody. I am Paul Ippolito. I am the Vice President of Facilities and Building Operations at the Museum of Science, and my pronouns are he and him. And so I will, give me a second to start my presentation. And we are off. Thank you. So before we get started, just a little bit about the Museum of Science. So we believe as science and technology increasingly shape our lives, the Museum of Science strives to equip and inspire everyone to use science for the global good. Being among the world's largest science centers and being among New England's most attended cultural institutions, we engage nearly 5 million people a year. Approximately 1.5 million of those are here at Science Park. But we also engage people in museums around the world, in classrooms and online. And as you can see from this graphic, our unique location that connects Boston and Cambridge puts us at the junction of some of the world's most influential academic institutions and industries, local and state governments, schools, and the public. And trusted by each of these sectors, we are ideally positioned to convene, inspire, and create meaningful experiences for all. When we think about climate change, we strive to be a leader in using science to understand and consider the consequences of human actions on the Earth's ability to sustain and nurture life. But we really recognize that climate change and environmental sustainability are among the greatest challenges facing humanity today. And so when we looked at our climate action planning, we looked at it from 3 pillars. We wanted to prepare the museum for climate change or resiliency. We wanted to create a plan that got us to net zero direct emissions by 2050, but realizing we had to have goals along the way in order to reach that. We really wanted to make sure that where are we uniquely positioned as cultural institutions? That's our education and outreach. Right? I sit outside and look at the Charles River, and I can see other buildings in Boston and Cambridge that can do resiliency, they can do mitigation, but they don't have quite the educational and outreach that some of our cultural institutions and universities have to offer. But what really caught me through this whole process was just thinking about climate justice and the equity. While we have a strong presence of DEI at the museum, just thinking about how climate action impacts that was something that we started to look at. So when we think about resiliency, we know that climate change is upon us. We know that we have to develop resiliency measures to face these events. And we know that by safeguarding our facilities and grounds, we'll also reduce the demands placed on emergency services elsewhere. We've heard a lot about what climate change is, but what we really look at here is we're looking at changes in temperature, sea level rise, unpredictable weather patterns, and extreme weather. We've heard a lot about sea level rise in the area, but what does that look like graphically? Here we are as we approach 2050. You can see these light shaded blue areas over here that's starting to infill. Here we are at 2050, past 2050, and here we are at 2070. So we can see that it's coming upon us. And these are the current projections that could get worse, or hopefully if we take some measures, we'll get better. We also look at what could happen to storms in our area and rainwater fall. It really caught me by surprise that who would have thought that a hurricane that hit Louisiana would dump 10 to 12 inches of rain in the New Jersey, New York area. We need to prepare for things like that. And this picture on the left shows that it has happened, and it does happen. And we also know that we have extreme heat temperatures that are increasingly rising across our area. So we need to prepare for that as well. So we have an internal team looking at some of these things. We're identifying the climate risks, property baseline, vulnerability assessment. We'll create and review recommendations and solutions. We'll prioritize these strategies. Financing is obviously a big piece of it. We'll create a plan, but really we have to keep implementing the plan, evaluating it, and readjusting it. When we look at mitigation, our statement is, it is our mission to inspire a lifelong of science in everyone. And our vision is a world where science belongs to each of us for the good of all of us. So it's in that spirit that we're committed to developing a plan that achieves net zero greenhouse gas emissions prior to 2050. And we have goals along the way in order to achieve that. So we try to look at the emission targets. And so we are a place of assembly. And so there are targets along the way that we want to achieve. So for instance, in calendar year 2019, we were at 8.3. So we were looking pretty close. I kind of have to throw the last 2 years out of the equation with COVID and building shutdown and people not visiting. But right now, our preliminary numbers for last year that are just closing out in December show that we're just slightly above 6. We have made some significant strides in that area. I've been at the museum for over 14 years, and since that time, we've dropped our energy usage by over 30%. And so we still have a long way to go, but we've made great progress along the way. So we'll look at things like upgrading our mechanical systems, lighting system, things that we've been doing all along, but we need to do a more vigorous process of it, the building envelope. And then also what role might renewable energy systems play? We really need to look at the entire building as a system and think about things that we can do, such as could ground source heat pumps be a way for the museum and things of that nature. This is a pretty simple slide, but I like to show it because it shows it graphically. And you can see that along the way, we've been dropping our energy usage. Then boom, 2015, something happened. And it shows two important things on this graph. While after 2015, we lowered our overall energy usage, our greenhouse gas emissions went up. And what this really highlights is the impacts of our choices. So in 2015, we started using district steam. This was steam that was created from the local plant and was being discharged into the local area. We thought it was a great benefit for everyone in our area that we could then take that waste steam and use it as our heat source for the museum and other buildings in Boston and Cambridge. What we didn't really look at the time was the efficiency of district steam when it's calculated through the energy portfolio manner is different than if you're producing it on site. So even though we were using less energy, we were actually increasing our theoretical greenhouse gas emissions. Although again, this was waste steam, so there's a little bit of discrepancy there too. We start to chart our progress. So assembly areas, as I mentioned, are down here. By 2030, we want to be at 4.6, but we have a stretch goal. We want to make sure that we don't just meet the average of the assembly areas, we meet our 50% reduction, which is 3.6. So this is our requirement goal, and this is our stretch goal. So we also talk about our educational and outreach. So the museum wants to shine a light on our climate crisis through a series of experiences that highlight the impact of climate change. And through these, we want our visitors to learn about the impacts of climate change, consider the perspective of others and how different mitigation affects others negatively and positively. We want to make sure that our visitors become more confident taking action in discussion. We want to make sure our visitors will discover new ways they can be part of the solution. And it's our hope that these experiences will affect not only the individuals who take part in them, but also the broader community. And we have an unbelievably talented exhibits and programs team that are creating these offerings for our community and for our visitors and for our staff. Climate justice is probably one of the biggest things that this cohort brought to us. While we all understand the benefits of how reducing carbon gas emissions benefits the area in its entirety, we're also looking at what we can do as an institution ourselves to help do that. So we have a DEAI committee at the Museum of Science, and they are helping us look at different measures that we might take as a museum beyond just reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. Part of that is our education, but part of it is what can we do to help the community when these instances are happening. The last piece, I just want to talk about the process that we went through with the Green Ribbon Commission and our cohorts. So really one of the biggest things of this was the cohort's ability to collaborate with our peer institutions. We're able to interact with our peer institutions. We're able to learn together from our peer institutions. It was great to have set times with breakout groups into smaller pieces. It was also good to have office hours where we could come in and talk directly and have specific questions answered. And it was also good to have some technical experts available to answer some of our questions and help guide us. Nothing better than me sitting with Dallas, showing her something, and I see a puzzled look on her face and say, you know what, if my wording's not clear to her, it's not going to be clear to others in our institution and the community. So it was a great sounding board. It was a great learning experience. We learned so much from other institutions, and we were glad to share whatever we could to other institutions as well. We have an internal team of the museum made up of people from, I lead the operations piece, but we have people from advancement. We have people from HR and our DEAI committee, exhibits, our exhibit content people, our facilities people, finance, marketing, programs. We have a green team. We have our senior leadership up above. We also have our board members and trustees, and we actually have a facilities committee made up of board members and trustees. So we have a strong group that works through there. I will say we still have a long way to go to outline our plans, get it out there, and talk with our staff and get their input and continue to get that. And then again, just the resources that were available to us. I think you've heard that a little bit: whiteboards, guidebooks, backpacks. Here's our graphical representation of some of the work we did on our Jamboard sessions. You can see our resiliency, our mitigation, our educational outreach, the climate justice and equity. But what I can really say is that it was great to have these programs because it also gave us deadlines to keep us on track beyond just these tools to help navigate us forward. And that was invaluable because we all have so much work to do and so little time to do it, that this was just great to keep us on track. And I'll just finish up by talking about some of the next steps. We have a lot to do. We have way more than I thought we had to do, but we've also made some great strides. We're not where we want to be, and I'll say yet. And I'll also say, like, you know, I think you heard this before, but unlike some of our private industries and educational institutions, as cultural institutions, we don't necessarily have a person or a group of people dedicated to climate action planning. So we are competing for time, resources. We also lost, I would project, about 3 months due to COVID. I can tell you that for the months of November, December, and January, more than 50% of my time was predicated towards COVID-related items. So we're behind, and that's okay. We will make up for it. And I'll finish up by saying this is a dynamic plan. The one thing we know for sure is this won't be our final plan. Instead, it really is just a framework. And if this was our final plan, it would not be a good one because technology will change over the next 10, 20, 30 years. People will change over the next 20, 30 years. It is a good framework, and it'll be something that we are constantly evaluating and working on. And with that, I am going to turn it back over to Amy, who will navigate through our Q&A session.
Great. Thank you, Paul. That was wonderful. And thank you, Cliff. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Dallas. We are right on time for a good, healthy, long Q&A session. And I will be pulling audience questions out of the chat, so please put them there. Well, also, some of your questions are going to be answered right in the chat if you direct them to a specific person, so feel free to do that. While we're getting organized here as panelists, I will just say a couple of comments. One is, we've emphasized here that this is sort of an all organization effort to get a climate action plan done. And I think that's been underscored by the fact that we have someone from facilities, someone from finance and administration, and someone from programs here. And each of them was leading this process for their institution. And then going back and carrying the message to the other parts of the organization. So it can work from, whatever door you want to open to get into this process, it can work. Second thing is, why did we start this pilot project with cultural institutions? First of all, they were game. And I have to say, in the past 2 years, if anyone was going to be game, I would have thought they're the ones that are just really don't have time, but I really admire the spirit of this entire sector and all the institutions that we've worked with. And it mattered to us as the Green Ribbon Commission because this group has a unique capacity to share out and communicate with a very broad public about what they're doing. And that's super important. And finally, as we build up to signing folks up for our next cohort that will kick off this summer, early this summer, June, I don't think anyone's mentioned the fact that it is at no cost to the organization to go through this process with us. You may want to hire your own consultants for different pieces of it separately and outside of this process, but the Green Ribbon Commission is offering it for free. And we have received many generous donations, largely drawn from the trustees of these groups. And I want to just thank them, and that's what's supporting this all. Okay, so with that, let me kick off with a couple of questions and try to get some that are kind of broad here. One is, I think this is for Dallas. Do you see this as being applicable to other kinds of organizations, like the particular question was about K through 12 schools, or, would this work for anyone?
Yeah, it really will. I mean, what we aimed to do in developing this process, because, and this is actually a good place for me to pause, and share all the full collective of our cohort this year. Because even though we're saying cultural institutions, what the size of the organization and sort of what they do was differed greatly. So we had Boston Center of the Arts, the Esplanade Association, Goethe Institute, Huntington Theater Company, Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, Museum of Fine Arts, Museum of Science, the New England Historic Genealogical Society, the Paul Revere Memorial Association, and the Zoo New England. So even though we captured this as like cultural institutions, there was a wide range of buildings and resources and staffing size that was going to be a part of this process. So if we created this program to be very specific, we would have already failed because there was just so much to go with. So we really tried to create the tools and resources that was kind of that framework and foundational. So no matter who you serve and no matter like the size of your building and all those things, that it could be adjustable for you. And we received great feedback from our participants this year, our cohort members this year, on things that we can do to adjust and to support like the different size and types of organizations. But I know that I personally have worked with secondary schools and have seen these tools and resources work in other organizations and types. Mm-hmm.
And I think our interest is in to answer another question, getting our materials online so it could be a self-guided study eventually, although I would strongly recommend doing it as a group with a facilitator, and B, finding other channel organizations to help organize their own groups. So if whoever wrote the question about the schools is willing to say, yeah, I'll recruit 10 schools and I'll get it all set up and we can use your materials and we'll adapt the materials for that group. That's exactly what we want to do. As the Green Ribbon Commission, we don't have the capacity to run multiple of these processes all at the same time, but we would love to share the resources. Great. Now there's been several questions about reaching communities of color, how the institutions were chosen, and I think pressing in a little bit further on the the climate justice and climate equity aspect of this. And I don't know who would like to kick that off, but do you feel that the beginnings that we've made of reaching out to communities of color has been helpful to you? And then how would you recommend, you as people who've gone through this, reaching out even further? That's at anyone, I guess. Maybe I should be more specific. I don't know, Paul, you talked about that.
Yeah, so oops, hold on a second. I think I'm talking, but we're still locked on Amy, but that's okay. I can still talk. I think that it is open to everybody, but I think it's a great lens to look at it from is if people don't know that the resource is there to join this cohort, it's hard for them to take a part of it. So I think it's a thing that we look at the museum all the time. How do we reach that audience? So I think it's something that the Green Ribbon Commission could look at. Is there a way to reach out to other sections of the community that may not be aware of what's happening here? And I think I don't know who, but I bet you somebody at the Museum of Science could actually help with that. And I'm sure it's people at the City of Boston could be a great resource for that.
Right, and the person who asked that question, Claudia, if you want to be in touch on that as well, that'd be great.
Amy, if I may, one of the ways that I interpreted this question was, accessibility to this program at large.
Yeah.
Is that, yeah? And this is a growth area, I think, for a lot of organizations. We've sort of cast our net of the networks we bounce around in. And I know just in my work and working with the Green Ribbon Commission is realizing you have to have more seats around the table to expand your network of people that you collaborate with and connect with. And if we're always just talking to the same people, we're always going to have the same faces that show up. And so I think part of this is to have that more intentional outreach and connection, and not just giving this opportunity out to the same people today. So, if you're there and you have a connection to a more diverse and broader set of communities who would have a lot of opportunity to take advantage of this, please connect us so myself and the Boston Green Ribbon Commission can expand our network of individuals to make sure we are offering it to the most diverse and more equitable framework as possible.
So there's anyone else have a thought on that before I move on? Okay, there's a question that came in early on around when Dallas was first showing her slides of the sort of the process and the different things that are happening month by month. One was what barriers are there under social deviance? And so that was, and related, please describe a baselining assessment. What staff are involved? And I think this sort of opens the door to a conversation about maybe going through a little bit step by step on what exactly we did or have done so far. And then maybe panelists can chime in on this was harder, or I scratched my head about that. I needed to involve these people. So Dallas, maybe you could just walk through the 4 big categories of activity that this curriculum is built around.
Yeah.
And don't forget social deviance question along the way.
I love the social deviance. Yes, I realize I could unpack each of those a little bit more. Social deviance is the fact that we as human beings, we really want to go with norming and the norms. And so I think a lot of people might not want to bring climate action planning into their organization because we don't have time for that. Our norm is to only focus on, our day-to-day operations and not on this other thing. And so that can be a barrier, even though you want to do it, you don't bring it up because it's a social deviant act for your organization, right? You're doing something against the grain, or you're asking people to do something different than they do on their day-to-day. And I think that can be a big barrier. It's the same reason why, when we started using reusable mugs, like you might not want to have been that person walking around with your reusable container all day until you saw a majority of people do it. So that's what a social deviant behavior element can be. So I'm sharing my screen now of the guidebook that the participants have access to. And we can just sort of talk through the different steps and how we guide everyone through it. So, if you're in the groundwork, what we take before we give anyone homework assignments, we give everyone sort of an overview of the tools and materials that we're going to ask them to do. So we have our goals and agenda for the day, and then we record all of our sessions in case something comes up in your life and we don't want you to miss out on some of the content and conversations that happen. But then people have links to resources. So we have some examples of documents that you would put together, key steps you should make. We give resources and examples of other organizations. And then we actually have like a Jamboard for you to jump in and do a stakeholder map and think through those pieces. So a lot of those templates were created in advance in order for when a homework assignment is given, you've had an opportunity to look at it, maybe even practice it in the meeting, and then you actually go and do the work as your homework. So specifically to your baselining question, you're going to see sort of a similar theme. We actually had 2 sessions around baselining. The first one was just to give an anchor to everyone about like, what is mitigation? What is greenhouse gas baseline? What is climate risk? What does that mean? What is social impacts? What are all of those pieces? And this is where we had our technical experts come in. And then we would ask people to come back with, again, their homework, which we would link to the resources. And they got to understand a little bit more about, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And we gave examples of the different tools that you can use to measure your baseline. So energy portfolio or SciMap or something that was a tool, but our technical experts went through those tools with them, and they showed up to office hours if there was more questions. And one great example is the group was able to kind of jump into the Climate Ready Boston map, put in their address, and then they were able to get a screenshot. So a lot of the screenshots that you saw today was our participants practicing this in their session and then going and populating the address with their location and was able to actually see it all come together. So those tools and resources were there. And the one thing that was really helpful also, so these are all the presentations that our technical experts gave, then we realized we had to keep it very simple and we gave everyone sort of a toolkit of like, if you were to do 5 things, just 5 things or less than 5 things to get your baseline started with climate equity and justice or with resilience, these are the 5 things you should do. And because we realized, this is their first generation of climate action planning. And we would rather have people make a solid, real impactful first step than overwhelm them with like too many things to do. And I will pass it on to Cliff and Christine and Paul to talk about what it was to being on the receiving end of these like templates and tools and processes, especially when it comes to the more technical things like baselining. So I'll stop sharing.
Christine, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, I think you saw my presentation. I really like the Climate Ready Boston tool. And I think when I brought it back to team, it just showed like why certain aspects were really important to do in terms of like heating and flooding and such. And I think also to keep it simple spreadsheet as well. I think it just, if I was lost and thought, where should I go next? it was good to always have like a document or a homework assignment to point me in the right direction.
Cool.
Right, now, I'll jump in a little bit and talk about sort of, I think the question was about how to do the baselining. I think a lot of us got a good head start because of the size of our buildings with the Energy Star reporting. I will say that baselining is a far reach. A lot of it is from the facilities staffing, but for us at like the Museum of Science, it is also our accounting team and finance because they have records and information. We have a traveling program team, so we need to get mileage and things from them. I can tell you that what we report through the Energy Star captures a good amount of it, but we're also looking at other things. And I will tell you that we will never stop looking. We will never stop finding things. We just sort of had an aha moment the other day on fugitive gases when we started saying, hey, you know, in our cafeteria, we have soda machines and those soda machines use CO2. Where is all that CO2 going? And how much CO2 are we using in a year just to dispense sodas into our cafeteria? So I think I think if you start off with the Energy Star Portfolio Manager, that will get you a long way there. We are really focusing on our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 is something we will look at much further down the road, but we are also hoping that if everybody is doing their Scope 1 and Scope 2, that will greatly reduce the Scope 3. And Scope 3 is a huge piece of the total emissions.
Cliff,
Let's
anything
yeah, go ahead.
to add there?
Not much, except just to say that the toolkit and the sort of common workspace model was tremendously helpful, and it continues to be helpful. It's just a great resource. So I think that's a huge part of one of the significant benefits for the program.
While I have you, you talked about leadership within your institution. And I know all three of these organizations have great leadership at the board level and at the staff level. But how, and you've all been at other organizations as well, and may have had a different kind of experience, I don't know, but how crucial would you say leadership buy-in is to this process? And what could you do without it or with it versus with it?
Oh my gosh, I think it's absolutely essential. I think it's imperative to have the conversations with leadership so that an organization doesn't sort of misplace a massive amount of work on something that is ultimately not going to have the level of support it needs. So I think the process overall needs to be very transparent and so that the organization is moving together in this work, which is, this is just the very early stages of this work. It's going to be decades worth of work. So I think it's absolutely imperative. And if you're in an organization that doesn't have that support right initially, I think you just need to connect with people in the organization who can have those conversations to use. I mean, that again points to the toolkit. There are some great resources in what we've been able to have access to as a cohort that really help those conversations and can help, I think, underline how essential this work is. And I think what can also help it is the timeline. You're not looking at work that it's essential that the organization do it in this 2-month period. It's a much longer timeline, but if organizations don't get going now, it just gets exponentially more difficult as we, even just a few years out, if you have any chance at really certainly meeting the city's goals, but to stay ahead of them, it will become almost impossible.
Are there any ways that any of you have experienced where this process of developing climate action plans that engage the entire organization have had sort of unexpected side benefits that may or may not be directly related to climate? We made the premise, or I stated the premise at the outset that that climate action planning is also sort of good organizational hygiene and reflects good management. So, do we have any evidence that this is happening?
I think for my organization, and because my background's in science, sometimes when we have members read the plan, they would, I think some things I would just say, yeah, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and just kind of think, yeah, everyone knows what those scopes mean. And I think having other people read it and ask like specific questions about what does that mean, or what do you exactly mean about environmental justice or climate justice, and like if these people are asking the questions, then anyone who reads the plan will also have these questions as well. So I guess it made me and one of my other colleagues more like, you know, specific or really explain it as we're writing and thinking about it. So yeah, just having other people in our group ask those specific questions or ask questions in a different lens makes the plan more holistic.
So certainly a communications benefit.
Yeah.
Any other engagement opportunities? I know, Paul, you've got a very large staff.
Yeah, I think for us here at the Museum of Science, it just happens. I mean, we in some ways it's almost harder to go the other way to get everybody sort of together because there's so many people running in different directions. Our exhibits and program team have been working on this, and so it's actually, we have the benefit of just trying to actually capture what they're doing and pull back in, and it's really less of a push forward for them. And we're also very lucky, maybe that's not the right word, but to have senior leadership that are so committed to it, from our board level to our president to our executive team. It is a big focus for the museum, so it's easy to get that buy-in at that level.
Yeah, that's great. And you know, I think as we begin the process of recruiting and screening and having conversations with organizations that are interested in joining us for next year, you know, leadership, having institutional buy-in at the leadership level, even if you are starting at, you know, 0.0 with your plan, the commitment to do that is a pretty crucial element.
Yeah, Amy, in regards to sort of the guidance I've provided with other organizations going through different varieties of strategic planning processes, you know, I think people sort of fear that leadership involvement means like needing to find time on their calendars, like to join all of these sessions. Like that's going to be unrealistic for a lot of organizations. So it really is, and this is something we tried to talk about earlier on, is as you're mapping out your climate action planning process, that you're thinking about checkpoints with leadership. So they're able to stay informed and engaged, and you're able to get feedback along the way. So when you show up with your draft, that the leadership isn't like caught off guard by this like set of goals and strategies and actions. They've kind of been involved throughout the entire process. So I think, you know, I just like to put that forward as there's different touch points depending on how involved your leadership would want to be in this process, but they definitely need to be engaged and have that buy-in.
So another piece that a lot of people wonder about, and we've got a couple of questions coming in on it, is resources. Time, certainly, staff time, certainly, we've kind of touched on that, but financial resources. So, you know, I think any one of you, and maybe all three of you, should answer this in your own way, because I think different organizations have different capacities to reach different operating and capital budgets in different ways. And it is certainly true that to implement a new strategic energy master plan and replace your systems, it is going to cost you some money. How to sort of feather that into what your organization is doing anyway, how to think about it, and then how to obtain outside financing or funding, I think is certainly going to be a question on everyone's mind. And I don't know if maybe Cliff, you kick off with you as the Chief Financial and Operating Officer of a large organization.
Sure. I mean, it's just like when we're talking about the leadership and board support, it's the whole way that this work is approached financially is really something that I think organizations need to address early on, even before they have, a specific plan outlining what they think is going to be the need, because it's more of an approach to how you handle, this type of work. I think it's in many ways parallel to just a component of capital planning overall, how you handle, overall deferred maintenance, a 10-year, 20-year, 30-year plan for the organization to address things. If you own buildings, it's very similar and just needs to get woven into that work. It's an essential part of both operating capital planning budgets. That it's not just an element that you're dropping in for a brief period of time. There are numbers of ways to handle it in terms of, yes, there can be different possibilities for external funding, but how you finance, how you expense it, how long it sits on your financial statements, all of these are things that need to be looked at early on and have an institutional understanding. So it's I think the wrong way to approach it is to put in all of the work and then just think that you're going to figure out ways to just fill in the holes for 1 year or 2 years. It's much more comprehensive than that.
Yeah, and that's really consistent with the co-step work that GRCx presentation we did in the fall that I made reference to earlier, and that is to stop thinking only about emergency planning for emergencies that might last for an hour, a day, or a week, and start thinking about chronic, ongoing impacts of climate change that are not going to go away year in, year out. And that, I think, is consistent with the feathering in and long-term thinking around financing. Can I press you, though, a little bit on, you said different external sources of funding, and name some of those?
I wish I could weigh in on that. We haven't explored that yet. So
Okay. I know some organizations are playing out fundraising, and there's this whole, discussion around advancement and development staffs needing to get more up to speed, more familiar with the vocabulary, start training, if you will, donors to be thinking that this is a very important area to be supporting, as well as exhibits and new buildings. And there is, as nonprofit organizations, you have access to different programs at the state or City of Boston level to get off balance sheet financing. And then there are the usual, regular sources of capital that you would go to anyway, like lending institutions. So there are a number of ways. I know Dan Yeager from the New England Museum Association has been asking, and we've been in healthy and probably too long conversation with him about getting a project going to bring the voices together and say, what about the public funding for these purposes for institutions, for cultural institutions, which really has not so much been on the agenda. And that is something that we want to continue to lean in on. But Paul or Christine, different institution, different needs. How have you approached this?
Yeah, so I'll jump in, and I apologize, for some reason the camera doesn't pick me up on voice activation. I'm not sure if there's some button that I clicked or whatever, but sorry about that. Yeah,
we can see you.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
I'm not highlighting on my screen. Great. Okay, so what we notice is that we do have to compete for funding, right? So we have to compete for funding for a whole bunch of different things. The quite honest answer is we haven't had any problems yet to do the reduction strategies that we've had to do in terms of funding. However, as we go forward, we don't know what to ask for exactly yet, right? So we need to create business plans. We need to come up with a business plan of what we want to do, what we need to achieve, what the results will be, and solicit the funding. We have the advantage that our advancement team is very focused on this as well. So they are talking with donors, they are looking at government agencies, they are looking at foundations. And I definitely won't put them out there because I don't want Cliff stealing my funds from other people that we, no, like kidding. But one other thing that we've been doing that we've been pretty successful with as we fundraise at the museum is we did this a while ago that we used to just say fundraise for a program or an exhibit. Quite a while ago, we transitioned that to be that when we fundraise for the whole thing. It is not just the program or the exhibit, but it's the whole infrastructure to support that. And so, people want to donate to this really great exhibit or program, but yes, you need HVAC, you need electrical, you need flooring, you need all that stuff to make it happen. We're now bringing that one step forward. When we did our last exhibitions, we're starting to look at it differently. Not only is it the program or the exhibit, it's also the infrastructure, but it's also the energy change. So we always try and design as energy efficiently as possible. But at a minimum, we want to make sure that if our new exhibit, and sometimes they have to, for great reasons, use more energy than what was there before, we want to make sure that we create projects within the museum that will, at a minimum, offset that increased energy. What we're really striving for is we want to measure and verify all of the energy usage being used in that exhibit and wipe that down to zero. So for our last set of exhibits that we put in at the Museum of Science, Arctic Adventure, and Engineering Design Workshop, we actually sub-metered those exhibits. And so we know exactly how many kilowatt hours we're using, I will say over the course of the year. It's only been 9 months. But we know what we're using for energy, and we are actively looking at projects. And in the fundraising, we have set aside some money to implement energy saving projects that will offset all of that energy usage. That helps us move us forward. But we still got to go further than that because we are still using that energy. So just a different technique and just a different way of looking at it.
So that's the energy accounting and the financing. And then Christine, you've got a very different kind of organization. You're managing a park essentially, but also building a new building. So how are you all thinking about the financing challenges?
Yeah, so we're definitely still thinking about it. And I guess that's part of the plan as we're thinking about the different actions and strategies of we're starting to figure out which ones are going to cost more money, which ones are going to take longer to, I guess, accomplish the goal with. And then some of the actions and strategies align with different teams if they're like a project or more horticulture based. So it could be financed kind of through those teams in a sense, through those budgets. But yes, we have lots of work to do in terms of the financing element.
That's actually our next step of our cohort meetings is operationalizing the plan. So these are really great questions, and there will be, templates that the groups can, begin the process to kind of thinking through timeline, priority, financial resources, just like ballpark estimates. So there can be something more substantial beyond the suggested goals and strategies and actions. But also to Paul's point, how does this get interwoven into the business model, right? How is this not like a sidecar project, but like central to how you do business? It's part of doing business is thinking about your climate action plan.
There's a question sort of segueing a little bit, but John Baldock, City of Cambridge, has been asking this question, and I also wanted to address it before we end, and that is how's the regulatory environment driving any of you? Specifically the new Boston, what's called the Birdo 2.0 ordinance that is, and Paul, you had a slide up that you didn't really talk about it, but it referenced the fact that buildings of 25,000 and eventually 20,000 square feet are going to be subject to emissions caps that will reduce every 5 years over time. So this is not only about the organization being more resilient, saving money, and doing the right thing, but also there is a kind of a stick here as well. To what extent would you say that new law, which was signed, I think, in September, October of this year, last year, to what extent is that driving you? The fact that that's in place, and there might soon be more of that kind of thing.
I think I'll say for the Museum of Science, when it first comes out, you're like, oh my goodness, what is this? But the reality is we're on that road anyway. I think it is nice. What I like about it is it raised the level of awareness it sort of created I'll say for us anyway, an artificial incentive that, hey, we have to do this, but we're doing it anyway. But what I do sort of like is it sort of helped us create a starting point for what our goals and objectives would be. It was thought out pretty well in terms of giving like specific date ranges and milestones so that it wasn't just, hey, you got to get here by 2050, because we all know what would happen then. People would just sort of keep putting it off. So for us as a larger institution, I don't know that it had a huge impact, but it did raise the level of awareness, and that I guess that is actually kind of huge. For smaller institutions, that may be a little bit of a difference, but I think both, again, we're a little unique. We're in Cambridge and Boston. I think both the city of Cambridge and the city of Boston are not trying to make this be a punitive thing. That's the impression that we've gotten in conversations with them. They really want everybody to succeed. They really want this to happen. And I think it's a nice way to sort of put some baseline numbers out there for us to strive towards.
Yeah, that's a good way to structure it. Maybe I shouldn't say stick, maybe I should say awareness building. That if you don't, but it does have some financial repercussions if the caps are not met. Cliff, any thoughts on this from your side?
I think it's essential to map out all of the requirements and to make sure that if possible you're ahead of them.
Yeah,
because yeah, there are definitely going to be, as have been outlined, penalties for not meeting them. But I think if you ever get to that point, playing catch up is going to be very, very difficult.
that's an excellent point. The start now and build, and you don't have to say, oh, I'm not ready for a climate action plan because I don't know everything already. Well, that's the whole point. That's the whole point. And that's what I know Dallas has really tried to emphasize, meeting organizations where they are. If you don't have a climate action plan, that's why you're coming to this experience, right? And when you're done at the end of the year, when you're done with our immediate interaction in the cohort, that does not mean that is your one and done climate action plan. It means that's something you're building on, and it's a living document. There's a question in here, Christine, I'd love your thoughts on, which it's a little off the beaten track of what we've been talking about, but the role of biodiversity loss and how you're factoring that thinking in, and anyone can chime in, but since you're on the Esplanade, the role of biodiversity loss and how it's factoring into your climate action thinking.
Yeah, because that's one of, I guess, our sub goals, to making sure that the biodiversity stays intact in terms of not only the plants, but I guess the animals that are in there as well. So part of the plan is kind of getting really seeing all the different type of plants we have in there. I'm sure our horticulture team knows, but I don't know that information offhand, like how many different types of plants and different animals are in the Esplanade itself. So I guess we're just keeping it in mind of like, and it is one of our goals of like, let's maintain it. Let's make sure that we don't make it any worse than it already is.
Yeah, and I think it's a good question because, supporting the web of biodiversity on Earth really supports the ability for all of us to thrive, which is the same thing that climate action is all about. And if we don't stop climate change reaching an extreme point, then we are going to have even huger biodiversity loss than we have. And I'll just mention, I saw yesterday NatureServe in the New York Times. You can access this through the New York Times. NatureServe put out a massive biodiversity loss map in the United States. It's really worth going to look at and seeing where all the hot spots are. I will say Boston is not one compared to certain swaths of the southern US, but it doesn't mean we're not experiencing it. And a lot of the groups here are arts organizations, but also natural resource based organizations or museums with living collections like Paul or like the aquarium. So we're getting down to our last 5 minutes, and I want to just I'm just going to glance over here at the question list and see Questions about how we are defining carbon neutrality. I think that's a good question. The city of Boston has defined, has set a target of climate neutrality. And I believe knowing that 100% carbon free is going to be extremely difficult to reach. As we sit here today and look at 2050, there may be a small percentage of fossil fuels that we can't get rid of, but also there's the possibility that we can because of innovation. So how are you guys thinking about setting your goals around the term of fossil free or carbon neutral or, reductions percentages? I'm sure you all struggled with that.
Yeah, I would say that is, as you get sort of towards the end, that is one of the biggest struggles. I mean, right now, in terms of natural gas, we only use it for cooking, but that's because we switched to district steam. So, that will be a decision that we come to along the way is do we upgrade all of our cooking equipment to just be, induction or something else? I hope none of my chefs are listening to that, although that is becoming more mainstream. But yeah, that is a decision we'll have to make. There's going to be a lot of difficult decisions that have to be made. And at some point, we just may have to do it. And at some point, carbon offset credits might have to come into play to get to a certain point. That's not where we want to go. And we're hoping that the technology changes. I mean, I look at just what technology changes there have been. Some as simple as light bulbs going to LED have dramatically changed the landscape in a lot of our buildings. We're just wondering what the next one will be. So yeah, that's a little bit further down the road, but we are thinking about like, how do you become totally unreliant on fossil fuels, but also we're relying that the grid will continue to become greener, right? So we look at our emissions factor based on our electrical usage, or as an example. As that grid becomes greener, by default, all of our greenhouse gas emissions will come down somewhat based on that emissions factor. So tough question, tough answer. Don't know exactly what we're going to do just yet, but that is something we think about.
Thank you. Yeah,
one thing
great.
really briefly, Amy, I think one sort of aha moment for all of our participants is because a lot of people travel to Boston to come to some of these cultural institutions. And so I think, I sent a link about what scope 3 looks like. And I think when you think about fossil fuels free and we think about these things, all the different travel to their place is something that cohort members really had to pause and think about in regards to their greenhouse gas inventory and what that means for future planning.
Yeah, and I feel a little remiss that we really have not addressed the exhibits and material waste and travel aspects, which are, huge in the museum sector. And that's a piece that does get addressed in the cohort. And I'm sorry that we did not bring that out more fully or at all, really, in this hour and a half. But I do want to wrap up now and really thank very, very much from all of the GRC, and I think on behalf of all of the participants in this cohort, the fact that Christine and Cliff and Paul, were willing to go out there and share where they are. Thank you for all your hard work. Thank you, Dallas, for being there every single step of the way. And please join us for our next GRCx program. We do not have a date, but we are working, as I said last time, on a program that is going to look at insurance and climate risk in Massachusetts. Also, please join us for the next cohort. Dallas has put the brochure where you can apply, let us know of your interest in the chat. You can also reach out to one of us directly. And then for any trustees or directors of museums or other cultural institutions who are still on the line, in June, we're going to be doing a special for trustees, for fiduciaries program with Ceres, the organization Ceres, on climate governance. And it's in June. The date is TBD. It will be virtual, so it won't be hard for you to attend. And I'm very excited about it and strongly urge you to join us. Thanks again to the panelists. Thank you for the audience for joining us, and we'll see you next time.